Hi everyone, this is Dr. Stringer, and we are back again to talk about the war on drugs this week, or this class, whichever the case may be. Without further ado, I will get right into this because it's a little bit of a long uh, slideshow, so hopefully it won't take too long, but I'm going to try not to bore you all for too long with all this history stuff. Some of it's pretty interesting, though. Anyway, so you probably saw this if you read your textbook, but there's kind of two different approaches. Uh, and if you think about it, we talked about earlier in the class kind of this public health approach towards drug use versus kind of the punitive, more it's the drug user's fault for using drugs type of thing. And that really kind of gets at the two different approaches between President Obama and President Bush. And of course, there's other presidents that fit into both of these kind of types of strategies. Um, as you see with President Obama, he focused a little bit more on the public health issues, on prevention and treatment of illegal drug use, and President Bush was a little bit more focused on the tough on drugs approach. And we have seen over time some presidents start off being more pro rehabilitation and treatment, and then the politics of being seen as being soft on crime tend to kind of push them into being a little bit more tough on it. President Clinton being one who, in his first term, he was very pro treatment and prevention, and then in his second term, he went on to be very tough on drugs because in his previous election they had accused him of being soft on drugs, and so then he went on to put a whole lot of people into prison for drugs. Interestingly, he was actually the president who admitted that he had smoked marijuana before and he didn't inhale, and so I bet there was a lot of people in prison for marijuana that didn't much care for that. Anyway, so we think about the first kind of war on drugs goes all the way back to alcohol and prohibition. And I know I've talked about this to some extent in other lectures, but really that was our first big war on drugs, so to speak. If you're ever in Savannah, there is a really neat prohibition museum there that has kind of a speakeasy kind of hidden in the back, and there's a lot of stuff from the Prohibition era that you might find interesting in checking out. There's a couple of cool places in Atlanta too that are still kind of holdovers from the old Prohibition area. There's a place called the Red Phone Booth that's a speakeasy that you actually have to have the number to type into the phone to get the door open, which is pretty neat. And there's a few other ones around if you're interested in that sort of thing. I find it pretty neat, so I felt like I would mention it. In case you haven't noticed, I give you all these little tidbits of information that I know that you might, if you were taking this class face to face, you'd be getting a lot of these. But I try to supplement kind of this book stuff with more interesting things to help you all retain it and make it a little bit more interesting. Anyway, so this kind of all started with lobbying for prohibition. There was the Anti-Saloon League. There was something called the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. And this all started in the late 1800s, and then you saw prohibition in 1919. Now, this only lasted, it was ratified in 1920, but it only lasted, about 13 years because it was repealed in 1933. And it should be noted that, during Prohibition, nobody really stopped drinking. It just became kind of an illegal market, very similar to what we have today for other types of drugs. So it didn't really stop anything. As I mentioned before, it created a lot of violence with the mafia and Al Capone and everybody who was bootlegging and stuff like that was kind of led to it being repealed. Um, then moving into kind of some more other things that happened with criminalizing other mood-altering drugs with regard to particularly opium, morphine, marijuana, and cocaine in the early 19th century, um, or early 20th century, sorry. Uh, these things were all legal and used for various medical reasons up until the early 1900s. And so that's really interesting. If those of you that don't know, Sigmund Freud was a famous psychiatrist who actually did use cocaine himself, and he actually used to prescribe it to his patients for depression. And I don't know how familiar you are with the effects of cocaine, but I bet if you were sad and depressed, then a stimulant like that could wake you up and get you a bit more uh, activated, so to speak. But anyway, uh, this was kind of something that Freud has been criticized for some years, though. And so there were some early steps in criminalizing opium that started in California with some anti-drug ordinances in 1885, and then there was, I'm sorry, 1875, and it was very racially motivated. It was regarding kind of opium dens and Chinese railroad workers. And I think I've talked about this, how a lot of times we see these kind of anti-drug movements as being very racially motivated. We talked about that previously, and we'll go through some of that as we go through our lecture today with regard to all of the various policies throughout time. Um, and so there's some more legislation. The first state to pass this law against it in 1885 was Ohio. And then Illinois made selling or giving away cocaine without a prescription legal in 1897. And so this is all late 1800s that you see these kind of state legislation. But then later on, we'll see 1909, you see the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act. And so this just gives you a little bit of history. Earliest laws were not aimed at medical addiction, but rather aimed at recreational use. They didn't mind the doctors prescribing the opium, but they didn't want people using recreationally. Does that sound familiar for anybody familiar with the contemporary drug policies? Okay, if you get it from a doctor, but if that's not the case. Anyway, uh, so there was a lot. Essentially, white people were very threatened by Chinese immigrants who settled there. And if you know anything about U.S. history, especially well, it doesn't really matter which coast. But you think about New York. You had immigrants come in. You had the Italian immigrants, and different people coming from different countries, Irish, and people that were already there were very threatened by these immigrants. And so that's a very common thing that has happened. And we see today, even now, we have the kind of this political rhetoric around building a wall to keep out immigrants and things like that. And so these things tend to come up throughout history, and a lot of drug policy has been used to try to control people who, are threatening, so to speak. Threatening, I should say, threatening in quotation marks, because it's not a real threat. Making other people feel uncomfortable, I guess. And they called them gamblers, thieves, and prostitutes, and things like that, which led to the 1909 Opium Exclusion Act. Anyway, so similar things were going on with regard to cocaine in African Americans, even in the early 1900s. You see this come up again in the 1980s with African Americans and cocaine, but it's regarding crack cocaine in the 1980s. However, in the early 1900s, uh, there was a similar issue. It just wasn't involving crack. And so, of course, there was a lot of concern over African Americans under the influence of cocaine, and they were concerned that they would rape white women. Uh, Interestingly, I don't know if you all know this, but the police departments changed their bullet calibers from the 32 caliber, which is a relatively small bullet, to the 38 caliber, which they carried all the way up until they uh, eliminated the revolvers and switched to the 9 millimeter semi-automatic pistol, and then the 40 caliber semi-automatic pistol, and then now they're going back to the 9 millimeter. But anyway, they said that when this happened, early 1900s, they didn't have semi-automatic pistols; they were all revolvers, and so they said that the 32 caliber bullet was not strong enough to stop a large African American who was amped up on cocaine, and they needed a bigger bullet to do so. And so they switched to the 38 caliber bullet. I don't know if that's more effective or not off the top of my head, but that's what the political rhetoric was, at least. So when you see in 1905, you start to see this stuff come into the federal uh, landscape, so to speak. The federal issues start to arise, and which led to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And actually, in case you didn't know, before this, they actually put cocaine in Coca-Cola. That is not just a rumor. That actually was true. And so part of the issues that led to the Pure Food and Drug Act was that people wanted to know if there were drugs in their soda, so to speak. You might give it to kids and stuff like that. I feel like that's reasonable, right? Um, and so part of this said that you had to put the ingredients on a product on its packaging, and so required distributors to list the ingredients of the product, and that's fair. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture, in 1905, uh, President Roosevelt called for regulation of interstate commerce of all food, drugs, and drinks. Now, before this, uh, the federal government hadn't been interpreted to have this power to regulate this type of stuff through the interstate commerce. But remember, I talked about in constitutional law, they reinterpreted the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to give this power to the federal government, and that's why they started doing this. Um, so anyway, so they decided to regulate this through the Pure Food and Drug Act, and then they started to create this federal law in 1906. And it didn't outlaw the sale of any of this stuff. It just said that you have to put the contents on the label. So that's not a big deal, right? And this is part of this regulating interstate commerce. We just want to have a label on that. It's not too bad, right? There's a few different what do we want to say? Constitutional opinions about this. That your book goes into some more detail about this. Upheld the constitutionality. It's in good faith. The doctor maintaining addiction for client not allowed. Doctors cannot maintain addicts, so you can't prescribe these drugs to someone because they're an addict. If someone's addicted to morphine, you can't just prescribe them morphine. And so that led to some issues, obviously, as well. The Opium Wars in 1839 fought by Britain to force China to open that country to the opium trade, which China had outlawed. This went on in the 1800s, and we're not going to get into all this history. This is all international history that will bore you all a little bit more and extend our lecture beyond what it really needs to be. Anyway, so the Harrison Act in 1914, this really got into uh, trying to requiring prescriptions for different drugs. To say, well, you cannot obtain narcotics, cocaine, heroin, things like that, unless it's registered, and it has to be a prescription. You can't just go buy it at the store. You can't go get it in your cocaine in your Coca-Cola. So you can't just go buy it in the pharmacy from the pharmacist. So it did not directly criminalize addiction, but it did say that you could not, the doctors could not prescribe these drugs to an addict, as it would be improper medical practice and then therefore illegal. And so by the mid 1920s, the medical profession had kind of withdrawn from dispensing narcotics to addicts. Prior to that, like I said, you could get a prescription for drugs from your doctor to maintain your addiction. Um, so some people argue that the changes in this legal status shaped a large part of the Harrison Act. You know, created a lot of what is our serious drug problem today. And one of the things that people say is that you should consider that the majority of the addicts, that were getting the prescriptions from drugs were from the doctors were white middle class middle aged women. But then after that, once this legislation went into effect, then the majority of addicts were predatory street criminals and inner city males. And so that really led to a big shift in what was going on with addiction in the United States, which some people are unaware of. So moving forward, and you fast forward just a little bit to 1937, I think I've mentioned the Marijuana Tax Act before, And essentially, this was something that made taxes required for marijuana, but then they didn't issue the stamps, so essentially it made it illegal. But anyway, as I've mentioned before as well, marijuana use stretches back for thousands of years. It's got a lot of medical uses. We're starting to see this kind of come back now, and a lot of states have legalized recreational use, and almost all of them have started to allow it for um, medical uses, although it's still not allowed under federal law. And as I've mentioned before, a lot of people believed during the 20s and 30s it would cause people to be violent and insane, which, those of us today would just think that's a crazy thing. If someone tried to tell you that, then you'd think that they were crazy, right? Um, so from 1914 to 1931, this was kind of what was called the local phase of marijuana prohibition, because you would see kind of some cities and states and stuff that would pass laws against marijuana, but there was nothing big at the federal level until the 1930s. Then the Federal Bureau of Narcotics got involved. And for those of you that don't know, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics is essentially what we had instead of the DEA. And the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Agency, is currently the federal entity in charge of drug enforcement. Back then, it was called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Um, so, in this change during the Drug Control Act of 1970, they restructured it to call it the DEA. Anyway, so there was this guy named Harry Anslinger, who was the big person that led this whole marijuana tax act issue. And essentially, what had happened was they were going to restructure the FBN back then, unless he had, essentially declared war on marijuana. And even before this, he had said that marijuana is not a big deal and we don't care about this. But then, in the interest of keeping his job, he started to engage in a big media campaign and lobbied legislature to convince people of the public evil effects of marijuana, even though he knew that they weren't true. He later went on to tell people that the whole thing behind marijuana and the Marijuana Tax Act was all political. But anyway, uh, so essentially in 1937, there was the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, and I think I mentioned before that marijuana was spelled with an H back then as well. It's really crazy to think about it. Changed the way we spell things from 1937 until now. From now, but anyway, and essentially it made a tax for anyone to possess marijuana, but then they didn't they didn't issue the taxes, which essentially criminalized it, right? And like I said, that was part of the reasoning behind the Commerce Clause, because they didn't have that power to actually criminalize things yet. That was still a power for the states to have. Oh, um, so through the act, it effectively, you know, uh, banned all or possession and sale of marijuana. This was superseded by the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, and I'll get to that in a little while. Essentially, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 superseded all previous drug legislation. So everything before that was overturned. There's a couple of other pieces of legislation that came in between here and the Controlled Substances Act. The Uniform Narcotic Act. It tried to treat marijuana as a narcotic. It was pretty controversial. Attempted to unify state laws. The Boggs Act established a bunch of mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenders. Narcotic Control Act. Uh, Option to impose the death penalty for offenders who sell drugs to juveniles. So obviously, these were in the 50s. Of course, these were overturned by the Controlled Substances Act in 1970. That was what we were talking about here. It's also called the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Controlled Substances Act. That's a bit of a mouthful. So it created a whole bunch of different stuff, including the drug scheduling system that we have today, which I think we talked about a couple of lectures ago. Like I said before, it superseded and replaced all other federal drug legislation before that came along. Um, so um, Nixon was the only, a recent president whose record reflected a stronger commitment to rehabilitation and treatment than enforcement. And he really didn't believe in that. Like I said, Clinton kind of did at first, uh, but then he kind of changed his mind on that. And then, so then after his reelection in '72, Nixon forced to go along with those demanding more punitive legislation, penalties, and drug offenses. Same thing happened with Clinton, like I said. So, despite the evidence that methadone programs are working, the public mood began swinging away from treatment and more towards punishment in the '70s. And so, of course, the president had to do so as well because he wanted to be reelected. Of course, in 1974, Nixon resigned due to the Watergate scandal, and President Ford took over. Um, Ford had little interest in any of this; he just didn't really care. Um, so, federal support for treatment programs kind of declined, and the funds kind of went back to enforcement because Ford didn't have any interest in that. And a tidal wave of drug incarcerations were about to begin as well. Um, So then we flash forward just a little bit to look at the schedules, and I think I've been through this before, so I'm not going to talk a lot about this. But essentially, the five schedules that I believe are in your textbook in an earlier chapter as well. And we'll just kind of just keep in mind that those are part of this Controlled Substances Act that created those, and those are still in effect today. And remember, marijuana's up here with heroin and LSD. You have cocaine and oxycontin and morphine, which are actually below marijuana, which is interesting. Uh, so, and that's an interesting thing. Marijuana has a high potential for abuse and no medical value. So that's interesting, right? And then down at the bottom, your cough suppressants and stuff like that, which we talked about before. So looking forward to the Carter years. So Carter actually tried to decriminalize marijuana back in the '70s, but that actually obviously didn't happen. And so he was actually a pro marijuana legalization advocate. I think he only served for one term, as I recall correctly. He was uh, uh, beat by Ronald Reagan in 1980. Um, Part of what put Carter's legalization of marijuana thing down was that his drug advisor was busted for writing illegal prescriptions for a staff member, and so he had been, had this guy advising him to legalize marijuana, and he was essentially the drug czar at the time, right? And so it was working until they found this, and this whole scandal came to light, and then it kind of took all the water out of it. Of course, this happened, the year before or 2 years before the election, so Carter didn't get reelected. Um, yeah, so then we ended up with Ronald Reagan. And this was one of the most punitive eras of drug law enforcement in our history, and also coincided with a time of the crack epidemic. You may have heard of some of the things in history about crack babies and things like that. The death of Lynn Bias, who was a basketball star, and a couple of other people by overdosing on cocaine kind of fed into this. Um, and, as I mentioned before, this whole hype about crack is really kind of silly, in my opinion, because crack is no different than cocaine. The only difference is, like I said a few lectures ago, is that you put the crack in some water and usually in a spoon with some baking soda, and then you heat it up and then scrape it off of the top. So it's essentially the same drug. Anyway, so this is when what we call the war on drugs, the modern war on drugs, was declared in the '80s. Um, there is some controversy because Nixon had used the term war on drugs before. I think your textbook might say that in there, but they say that Ronald Reagan is really the one who declared war on drugs. So if in the future you're ever asked something about that, Dr. Stringer thinks that uh, that Nixon might have used the term, but as far as who declared the war on drugs, that was Reagan. So anyway, this led to a lot of zero tolerance, drug offenses. There's been little change in this stuff for a couple of decades. One of the things that happened when Obama was in office and is still going on today is that Obama told all of the federal prosecutors and the DEA and everybody to leave the states alone who had legalized marijuana. Prior to that, prior to Obama taking office, they were conducting raids in California at the dispensaries and stuff like that, and actually arresting people and things. But they stopped doing that. And after President Trump took over, he didn't seem to have much interest in it either, so he didn't reinitiate that. Uh, the Attorney General Sessions tried to bring the marijuana thing back up to light, but I don't think that worked out well for him. And of course, at the time now, President Biden is in office, and he doesn't seem to have any interest in revamping that either. Um, so one of the things that fed into the punitiveness in the crack epidemic in the 80s was this report by Robert Martinson in 1974 that pretty much said that nothing works for rehabilitation of drug offenders. Um, and so this kind of bolstered this conservative position that we should just punish drug offenders rather than try to rehabilitate them. Um, and so that report it showed what it showed, but it has some limitations, and obviously now it's quite dated. And so but that helped to feed some of the political rhetoric at the time. Um, so sentencing guidelines for drug offenses. We'll talk about this some more in a couple of chapters. But for now, let's just say that the guidelines were based on two main factors, being the severity of the offense and the prior criminal record. Um, they've come under a lot of criticism lately, not lately, but in the past, since they've been passed pretty much. And mainly because it takes a lot of the discretion away from the judge and gives it to the prosecutor. They created the Sentencing Commission in '84 and developed federal sentencing guidelines. And so that's happened in '84. We'll talk, like I said, much more about this. A lot of this was trying to get away from some of the discretion and eliminate some of the disparities between race and things like that by having people sentenced on these specific factors rather than just kind of a judge picking whichever sentence they wanted to give someone. So some contemporary policies, you have the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Act of 1984, which required 5 years for if you're caught in possession of a gun and you have drugs. The Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1988. Those you end up. This is what creates this 100-to-1 crack to powder cocaine sentencing ratio, and we'll talk more about that when we get to that part when we get to sentencing of drug offenders. And then in 1988, the death penalty for traffickers that caused death with a felony drug offense. The Supreme Court has said that you can't give the death penalty to anyone that hasn't been convicted of murder. Now, felony murder is a little bit different because if someone dies while you're in the commission of a felony, then you can still get the death penalty because someone has died, so then it's felony murder. So, for those of you that don't know, felony murder is when you are in the act of committing a felony and someone dies. It doesn't matter if you killed them or not. So, if you are robbing a bank and your accomplice gets shot by the police, then you can still be charged with felony murder, even though it's the police that killed your accomplice, because you were in the act or of committing a felony for bank robbery. And so this can obviously apply, if you're trafficking drugs or dealing drugs or something like that, and someone gets killed, even if you're not the person that murders them, you can still get convicted of felony murder. These acts also created what is known as asset seizures or asset forfeitures, which essentially allow the government to take your possessions and seize them. And these are also much lower burden of proof on this, so it's just a civil offense. So even if you're found not guilty in criminal court, they can often still keep your property because it's a civil offense, and the burden of proof is lower. It's only a preponderance of the evidence in civil court, whereas it's beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal court. Um, that was about all I have on the history. Please read your chapter and look at the more intricate details of this kind of stuff. But I'm just trying to hit the high points for you all. So I hope you all have a good day, and I'll talk to you next time.